Welcome to the Looking Glass Devadasi History Factoid series. Who is a Devadasi? The minute I say Devadasi, you will immediately think of a temple dancer. Now the term Devadasi is Sanskrit, but in the Tamil country, she was known by very many different names. Let us go through this chronologically. I'll take you back to the Chola period, 9th, 10th century. Mahadevar Adiyal is one term that finds mentioned in many inscriptions of the Chola period. Emperuman Atiyal, Alvaan Atiyal, Emperuman, Alvaan are all terms that are used in the Sri Vaishnava tradition, Vishnu temples. So, Emperuman Atiyal and Alvaan Atiyal. The term Deva, Devi, Devan are prominently seen in this 7th, 8th century, found in usage. Of course, it was there even during the Sangam period, but its prominence rose during the Bhakti movement, as Kapil's Venerable will tell us. Because the idea of Deva, the god, and the Adiyal, the devotee to the god, in servitude, was something that the Bhakti movement really brought to prominence. So the Devaradiyal had a transactional relationship with the deity and therefore the temple. You find so many inscriptions where the Devaradiyal has given several gifts to the temple. Gifts in the form of gold, jewelry, different puja articles, so many different things. Land sometimes. And in return, the temple seems to have given her the title of Devaradiyal and also the honorific of singing and dancing in worship for the deity as a service. So this transactional relationship is really denoted in the term Devaradiyal. She is not a servant as in a slave, but she is a servant as in someone in servitude. There is another term that is beautiful that's used. Devanar Magal, the daughter of Deva, the daughter of God. So the transactional relationship is not merely as the wife of God, but also the daughter of God, someone who had a familial relationship with the temple, the deity, and the society in which the temple existed. She was also called Talaikoli in several inscriptions. Talaikoli is a term that we find in Silapadigaram. Madhavi was given the title Talaikoli. So you see that these are all terminologies that you have for whom we identify later as Devadasi. There are also other terminologies like Taliyilar, Taliyar, Padiyilar, Padiyar, so on and so forth. Chola period also has another very interesting term called Shanti Kuti. Again, Silapadigaram tells us that Shanti Kutu was a ritualistic dancing repertoire tradition of the period, and therefore she was called Shanti Kuti. There was also Shanti Kutan. So these names existed in usage, and around the 13th century we get more names, 12th, 13th century. One such was Vinnappam Seivar. Vinnappam is appeal. So using hymns to sing the praise of God, singing Tiruvampavai, singing Tiruppavai, singing Tevarams, and invoking the God was Vinnappam Seivar or Vinnappam Seival. The Pandya kings and inscriptions that you get from their period, in fact from the Pandya time all the way to the Nayak times, we find several other names. One very prominent one was Manikam. Chaturakala Manikam was one very important name. So you see the word Sadar there. Arpuda Koot Manikam. These are all terminologies that you see. So the idea of the Devadasi is really someone who's connected to the temple in service through music and dance and other ritualistic practices like the Tiru Alati or bringing flowers for the temple, so on and so forth, in a transactional mode as the daughter or the devotee of God. The term Devadasi is what the world understands, but in the Tamil country, she was more prominently known as Devaradiyal, a term that denotes her beautiful relationship with God and temple and deity in an honorable status, but a term that has today unfortunately become a deeply insulting, stigmatized pejorative. Welcome to the Looking Glass, Devadasi History Factoid series. Why is there a stigma attached to the name Devadasi? Not just in the imagination and perception of Indians, but also the world over, Devadasi has a long historical imagination. I'm going to take you through some important moments that led to this perception. Let's go to 13th century when the traveler Marco Polo was traveling through India. In his works, he refers to women artists of the Mabar or the Malabar region as singers and dancers and entertainers. Nothing in the negative connotation, but his works, when they were later translated, especially in French, there was this particular reference where the Devadasi is depicted almost as the equivalent of a nun in the Christian faith, but who was an entertainer. So it was the intersection of faith meeting gender, meeting art that was problematic to the imagination of the European mind. In the 14th century, another traveler named Nicole de Conte comes to India and he goes to Vijayanagara Empire and is enamored by the grandeur of the kingdom. He notes that the Devadasis there, or the women there, singers and dancers, enjoy great social position, high status. Similarly, in the 15th century, another traveler named Domingo Piaz travels to the Vijayanagara Empire, and this Portuguese traveler too writes highly of the Devadasi women. In fact, he uses the term bailadeira, a term from Portuguese that moved to French, to German, to English, and has remained. Thus, at this time, the Devadasi became an important part of the traveler accounts. Slowly, in the 16th century, we see a condemnation that rises about the character of these women. It is around the same time that in the Tamil country, we see literatures like the Ula literature, where the Devadasi's voice, body, and mind are asserted. Bold literatures that talk about her sexuality are being written and are in the public circulation. For example, this Venetian traveler, Jasper Balbi, he travels to India and in his accounts, he calls the Devadasi a temple whore. In the 17th century, travelers like Francois Bernier start making very strongly worded descriptions of the Devadasi as someone who is in the problematic space of religion and entertainment. He famously calls her the prostitute. His works, of course, traveled far and wide and were translated in many languages. So what Francois and people like him wrote was read around the world. And he said women of this community, the Devadasi community, were exploited by the priests in the temple, and therefore religion was used almost as a cover to exploit young women. According to writer and researcher Joe Parr, the Devadasi as a term appears for the first time in European literature only by the 18th century in the Jesuit missionary letters. The German philosopher Bartholomew Zeckenbach, who was living in Tarangampadi or Tranquilbar here in Tamil Nadu for many years, starts making extensive notes about Indian culture and society, and amidst that, he makes important observations about the Devadasi as he saw it. He wrote about them and their life and their ritual practice and their worship and the curiosity, the amusing curiosity with which he wrote. He said, these women are providing entertainment for the society, and therefore the song and dance and their very existence feels like an insult to a decent Christian life. By the end of the 18th century, the Devadasi and her identity in the Indian society, but particularly in the world as she was understood through the various writings, was embedded as a woman who was promiscuous and who was a public woman and whose character and moral authority could be very questionable. But around the same time in the 18th century, a Dutchman named Jacob Hafner writes a radically different account. He says the Devadasis were women who were taught to sing, dance, they were taught history, they were taught to read and write, they were taught rituals and worship. He says they were extremely accomplished, nothing like what the other travel accounts make them out to be. He also says that unlike what has been said about their promiscuity and the exploitation by the priest, he says the women had tremendous agency or tremendous ability to choose their partners. And he says they always chose, of course, from the castes that were higher to them, but they had choice. So both narratives are floating, but Jacob Hafner's kind of narrative were far and few, while the other narrative was very dominant. It is in this line of imagination and perception and understanding that someone like Dr. Muthulakshmi Reddy, who herself belongs to the Devadasi or the Isevalalar caste, but of course someone who broke free, whose mother allowed her to go on and acquire an education in English and thereafter do medicine, comes back to talk about the life and exploitation of young girls as she saw. She says the act of dedication of these girls to temple is really the very crux of why their lives are ruined, and therefore she identifies the banning of the Devadasi dedication as the one move that can free them of this suffering. She appeals to the minds of those who are educated and enlightened on the floor of the Legislative Assembly when she is proposing this bill that was later passed as a law. And she says innocent young children are suffering from the evils of this dedication. Not only that, they are also suffering from contagious diseases that are contracted through the profession of prostitution. She, of course, advocates the Devadasi anti-dedication bill as an antidote to bringing them and integrating these girls into the larger society as respectful, virtuous, loyal wives and affectionate mothers, as well as useful citizens. The stigma, therefore, attached to the name Devadasi is one that has acquired over these centuries through the very many writings, the very many understandings of Indians as well as foreign travelers, as well as translated accounts, and the Indian experience of the Devadasi. Welcome to the Looking Glass Devadasi History Factoid series. What happened in 1947? India gained her independence, but for Tamil Nadu and for dance history, it's an important year because it was in 1947 that the Madras Devadasi Prevention of Dedication Act was passed. There was a growing anti-Devadasi sentiment that brewed from the late 19th century all the way to the 20th century. the educated people, the elite people in the society saw many Hindu customs and traditions as regressive practices. The Devadasi Act came as a refreshing reform in their minds to release and free these young women from the exploitation. In 1901, Madras Census report classified the Devadasis under Group 5, numbering them to the total of 6,800 odd women. But it was a conservative number because there were several other women who did not fall within the ambit of this survey. The colonial rulers had a golden dictum, which was to not really interfere too much with regards to religious customs of the natives. But at the same time, it was works like Mother India that was written by the American journalist Catherine Mayo in 1927 that strongly criticized the Indian society for being weak in being unable to free young women from the exploitation of child marriage and sexual exploitation in the name of religion. So the Indian society felt very instigated and insulted that the world was looking at India as some sort of a regressive country. The ambit of the court found it very difficult to interpret the IPC or the Indian Penal Code 372, 373 with regards to inheritance when it came to Devadasis, because the practice and custom was dictating something, but the law was moving in a very different direction. Again, around this time, World War I forced Britain here in India to share power with the Indians who wanted to co-rule with them or co-govern with them. The famous Montagu-Chelmsford Act of 1919 allowed for Indians to be part of governance here. This meant that they started pushing the Devadasi dedication prohibition bill in the Legislative Assembly. But to this effect, preceding this very bill, there was another bill that really changed the life of the Devadasi, which was the amendments that were brought to the Hindu Religious Endowment Act in 1929. Here, they introduced a concept where the temples would receive a quit rent from the government in return to relieving the Devadasi from her obligations of service. It also said that the Devadasi can enjoy any revenue from the lands that she was given as endowment until her lifetime. But the problem here was after her lifetime, her progenies, her next generations were not entitled to this land, which meant that inheritance became a huge issue and put them in the spin of economic degradation. Moreover, this rent-free inam that this act was suggesting was given to the Devadasis but was not given to the men. So the men had to pay a certain amount of money to be able to enjoy the revenues from some of these inams. All of this created a great schism between the men and the women in the community. Further, the Devadasis were given as endowment some dry and wet lands and some grains yearly. They seldom had any liquid cash from the temple that was given. This liquid cash for them came only from performances in social functions and outside the temple. What happened in this time was the public discourse was around her morality, and there was a huge debate about the necessity for a Devadasi and her social and moral character. This led to a lot of people avoiding the Devadasi's performance in social functions, which directly led to her economic impoverishment. On November 4th, 1927, Dr. Muthulakshmi Reddy proposed a resolution to stop the dedication practice of young girls and women to Hindu temples for immoral purposes under the pretext of caste, custom and religion. But on November 3rd, 1927, a deputation of Devadasis from the Presidency of Madras and the Devadasi Association of Tirunelveli sent an appeal memorial to Sir C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer, the then law member of the government of Madras. In this memorial, they had made elaborate defenses about how they were a custom, they had a very significant place in the Hindu society, and therefore they were respectable, etc. But they also further made an appeal to not entirely criminalize and ban them, but to in fact give them access to education and other reforms that would allow them to reintegrate into the society in a more dignified way. Between 20s and 30s, there was a raging debate both in the public domain as well as on and off in the Legislative Assembly about the need for a reformation of the Devadasi. On January 31st, 1930, Dr. Muthulakshmi Reddy presented the Prevention of Dedication of Women to Hindu Temples Bill. This was introduced and immediately sent to the Select Committee. The Indian elite vigorously went into huge public debate about this bill. It was presented again as a bill on November 26, 1947 at the Select Committee under the leadership of the Home Minister, Dr. P. This law that they were proposing was to criminalize the ceremony by which a woman of any age to be dedicated to the service of a Hindu temple, idol, including performing Gejja Puja, Muddirai, Kumbharati, etc. All dedication before and after the law was to be declared null and void. At the debate hour in the assembly, P. Natesan had made an interesting critique. He said this law felt disproportionate in its functionality because the number of Devadasis who were in the presidency were low, according to him, and therefore this law would only result in the discontinuation of the art form itself. To this, P. Subbarayan replied on the floor that he would very much encourage women from other communities to take up this art form, and also further noted that these Devadasi women were in fact condemned from not only performing in temples but also in any social functions such as marriages, etc. Dr. V.K. John, Mrs. M.N. Clubwala Jadhav, such people of great eminence in the Indian society came out in strong support and wrote and praised this bill that was being proposed. The bill was thus passed on December 5th, 1947 to become a law criminalizing the dedication of Devadasi in Tamil Nadu.